Hello, everyone. For those who just joined, my name is Joseline Nicholas. I am a real estate agent here in Southern Ontario. I specialize in a few markets because I'm an investor. So I buy properties in various markets around Ontario. That forces me to get to know the markets around here, but I'm most active in Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, and Hamilton. I do have a team, so we are as well able to go as far as Niagara. I do have properties in Niagara myself. So those are the markets that I specialize in. However, the webinar tonight is covering everyone in Ontario. So if you're thinking to sell a property that has a tenant right now in Ontario, this is going to be a webinar for you. Before we start, I have to disclose I am not a lawyer. I am not a paralegal. Tonight, I'm just sharing my experience as a realtor, my experience as an investor. So if you have any questions, in most cases, we have complicated situations. We have proper professionals who are in place to help us so that we don't have to deal with legal matters, because we know that legal matters are only for proper professionals who have the proper training for it. So everything I'm sharing tonight is for learning purposes, or to give ideas if anybody has any questions about selling a tenanted property. Okay, a little bit about myself. I am a full-time realtor and I'm an investor. I think I've said that a few times. My husband and I have been investing in real estate for the last 7 years, and we have some properties. Most of our properties are multifamily, so from 2 units, 3 units and upwards. And we have properties in Hamilton, we have properties in Niagara and Kitchener. And right now, actually, we are exploring opportunities to invest in the US as well, because I want to kind of spread our wings. And in most cases, I go into the various markets, not only to explore opportunities for myself, but to also explore opportunities for our clients. So as I discover markets that are better or markets with higher returns, I want to know that not only for me, but for my clients too. My superpower, if I had to pick one, would be in creating wealth through real estate. And I say that because, I've done it for myself. I've done it for my clients. We like to, analyze our numbers and see how much value we're adding to our clients' portfolio. So that is something that I really enjoy, and that's something that I'm happy to take to the next level. So that is my superpower. So tonight, we will be covering a few things. I will start by giving a quick market update as to what is happening in our market right now. We'll look at some tenant rights. And I must say that I'm only picking points that are relevant to our topic today. I know tenants have a lot more rights that I'm disclosing today, and landlords have more rights that I'm disclosing today. However, we're only looking at things that apply to the process of selling a home that is tenanted in Ontario. I will also look at some practical examples and advice from situations that I've had in the past, from my clients selling properties, myself selling my own properties, and then we can kind of learn and grow together. I will also go through a checklist for selling a tenanted property. So if you're on this webinar and you have a property that you'd like to sell, we can go through the things that you should be thinking about before you get your property on market. So today, the Bank of Canada has increased the overnight rate from 1% to 1.5%. I'm not sure if many of you know, but rates have been going up in Ontario starting in March. And as soon as rates started going up, we started noticing a change in the market. Today actually was the second 0.5 hike. That's basically where they're increasing the rates by 0.5. Usually what we're used to as Canadians would be like a 0.25% hike. However, the Bank of Canada has expressed interest to increase the rates significantly to reduce inflation. So what they've said is that we should expect more and more of these hikes. And what we've seen is as the interest rates go up, prices are actually going down. That's something that we're seeing. I am an economist by education. I actually worked for the government of Ontario before I got into real estate. So I love looking at data. And while I'm looking at data, there's a few trends that I've noticed. One of them is that we have fewer buyers in the market. One thing, as I speak to my clients, we probably had maybe 800 people in our own database who are looking for homes. But what we've seen is that a good 60% has said, you know what, I want to wait and see where this goes. So we have about 60% reduction on average in demand. And a lot of my clients, when I ask them, they say, you know what, with everything that's happening, the war, interest rate hikes, everything that's happening in the I don't know what's happening. So because I don't know what's happening, I want to wait. So, and it's a valid thing, they want to wait and see where this goes. We're seeing that some of the ones who had pre-approvals are coming back to the market just because if they don't use the pre-approval, it expires. And now they have to get another mortgage at a much higher rate. So we're seeing a mix of, depending on the situation. If you're a seller in this market, we definitely have to get creative, expose your home to as many people as possible. And not only that, we have to make sure that there's no situations that will prevent people from buying that home. For example, one thing that could prevent people from buying that home are properties that have long-term tenants that are paying, let's say, 2011 rents, and the property is worth, maybe $1 million or $2 million. The mortgage won't be covered by these rents. So we're seeing those kind of properties sit on market, and we do have solutions that would be appealing to both sides, both the tenant as well as the landlord. One thing we're also seeing right now on market is that inventory is going up. As soon as the Bank of Canada announced that they will be increasing rates, we started seeing more and more sellers list their homes. One thing that we've struggled with in the past was the inventory levels. If you look back to January, we had only 48 homes in the whole city of Guelph. I remember waking up one day and I was like, let me see how many homes are on market today. And on average, it was under 50, the whole of Guelph. And now we have about 205 homes on market. That shows you how high inventory has gone up. It has, multiplied by 4, in such a short time. And this usually isn't a problem because we've had markets where we have more listings on market. The only difference this time is that demand has gone down. So we've had more supply and less demand, which, results in lower prices. So I was looking at prices and I've been following the trend. Right now we're seeing in Ontario on average, prices have gone down by 100,000. In Guelph specifically, we've seen that prices have gone down by 135,000 in the last 2 to 3 months. So this is something that is happening. And to be honest, no one knows where the trend is going. No one can tell you what's going to happen next. We just know where we are right now. When we look back at previous markets and what has happened in the past, usually markets recover within, 3 to 7 months. However, this market is different because we have the problem of inflation, like really high inflation. And the Bank of Canada has said they will continue to raise rates until they take care of that situation. So because of that, it brings in uncertainty. Nobody knows where the market is going. One thing I would say is if you're a seller thinking about selling in the next 12 months, I think it's probably better to sell now than to wait because we don't really know what's going to happen. And if rates keep going up and inventory levels keep going up, that means prices will continue to drop. So if I was a seller thinking about selling, I would rather do it now than later, unless you have the ability to wait for, let's say, 2 years or 3 years to see what rates and where the market would be by then. Okay, so when we get into the rights of tenants here in Ontario, we know that here in Ontario, more than most states and most provinces, tenants they're protected, they're very well protected. And some of the rights that tenants have in place are they have the right to occupy the rental unit within the fixed lease term. So if you have a 1-year lease, they have the right to occupy that property within that year. But not only that, they also have the right to occupy it on a month-to-month basis. One of the questions that I get from my clients is, if the lease is ending, can I terminate the relationship with my tenants? Can I kick them out? And the correct answer is no, you can't unless you have a good reason. And we'll talk about some of those good reasons, but you can't just kick them out simply because their lease is ending. So they have the right to occupy that property within the lease period, but also after. That is very unique. Another thing that impacts us while we're selling the property is that they need minimum of 24-hour notice for anyone accessing the property. So this is for showings, for photography, for staging. Anybody who needs access to that property has to provide 24-hour notice. In most cases, what we do with these properties is we plan ahead. So we know we have a schedule of, let's say, this is when the stager is going to go in, this is when the cleaner is going to go in, this is when the photographer is. So we have a whole schedule and we can notify the tenants ahead of time, because the truth is, if you wait, or if you're not strategic about it, sometimes things have to be canceled because you forgot to give the proper notice. To avoid that, we have a system in place that will guide us and make sure that the tenants are well notified. For showings, we do have a system that will notify the tenants 24-hour notice, 24 hours ahead of time. And sometimes we've been able to negotiate with tenants to see if they will allow much less time. However, I don't encourage that, because the tenant can come back and say they didn't give me notice. It depends on the relationship that you have with the tenant. If there's one thing that you can take away from this webinar, is that my approach to selling a home that is tenanted is always cooperating with the tenant. Now, there's been situations where the tenant has said nobody's coming into this home. You know, it's happened before. And in that case, you might be wondering, what do you do? So as a landlord, you have the right to access the property for showings with 24-hour notice. However, the tenant can decide to say, no, nobody's coming in. They are wrong, right? Like they can't do that. However, for you to get that corrected, you have to go to the board, you have to wait for a hearing, and it could take 5, 6, 7 months. By that time, you probably will have missed, you know, the market or you know, whatever you had in place to, you know, the plans you had in place. So the best way I find is to cooperate with them, work with them. I've had situations where the tenant has said, and in some cases, I've had to bring it to them and say, look, legally, you cannot do this. I've had to say it to them, but then I'll say, I understand your situation, I understand where you're coming from, but legally, you cannot prevent the landlord from accessing the property with 24-hour notice. Instead of like fighting with them, we just come up with what would look like a win-win. What would it take for us to, you know, not in a begging way, but in a conversation way, such that they feel like we care about their feelings? Because in most cases, their concerns are valid, you know, especially with COVID. In those months when everything was under lockdown, it's valid. They're afraid. They don't want their family being exposed to this virus. However, the landlord also has the right to sell their property. So it's just coming up with middle ground where both parties can work together. And that is the best thing that I've seen works the best. Another point that will impact the sale of your home is we need at least minimum 60 days notice if you intend to provide vacant possession. And this only happens if the tenant is on a month-to-month lease. Now, I have to say that this is the minimum possible. In most cases, actually more than 60 days, because we have to provide 2 full months. So for example, today is June 1st. If I was selling a property today and we need to give the tenant notice to vacate the unit because the owner is moving in or because the owner's family is moving in, I would have to give them September 1st. Why? Because we have to give 2 full months. Today is June 1st. We're already in the month of June. So we have to give the whole month of July and the whole month of July and the whole month of August to make sure that, you know, we're giving 60 days notice. Now, in some cases, we might get away with issuing notice today because August has 31 days. And if today is June 1st, and August has 31 days, we're still giving 60 days notice. However, to be safe, we would just have to make sure that we're working with the paralegal team who can issue these notices. In most cases, we're working with these 2 forms that we can issue to the tenant. I like to make sure that the proper legal team is behind us so that we don't make mistakes, because any little mistake you make could cost you another. I've seen people who've paid $15,000, $20,000 simply because they made one little mistake. I'll give you a lot of examples. That section is coming, but these are things that we have to be thinking about as you're thinking to sell your home. Another point is, in whatever the landlord does, they cannot interfere with the tenant's reasonable enjoyment of a rental unit. So now, this usually comes up with landlords who are looking to renovate or to do work before they go to market. In most cases, you're able to do some renovations, especially minor work. However, for major projects, while the tenant lives there, you're not allowed to do that. That's something that we need to keep in mind. I've had a lot of my clients who do minor renovations, and in most cases, actually, we can sit and come up with a plan we can advise on what we think you should do, what we think will bring a higher return to your investment. However, in most cases, you cannot do a major renovation because then they need a place to live. Okay, so some of the landlord rights in this case is you have the right to sell your property, and you have the right to make repairs, and you have the right to enter the property with proper notice. Now, when I say you have the right to sell your property, it doesn't mean that you have the right to kick the tenant out in order to sell it. Whether or not you're able to provide vacant possession would depend on a few factors, and one of them being the reason why, like, why would you like them to move out? If the new buyer wants to move in, then you can serve a notice to the tenant specifying, and we need the buyer to put that in writing in most cases, because if they don't put it in writing and you issue notice, if anything happens, they choose not to move in, you as a landlord, you're on the hook for that. So the tenant can sue you. So we want to make sure that as a landlord, you're well protected. And that's why we'll bring in proper professionals as well. When I'm negotiating the offer on offer night, or when the offer comes in, I want to make sure that we have the proper clauses to protect you as a landlord. There's two ways to sell a property. And this, when I say this, I'm speaking in terms of like providing vacant possession to the buyer. This usually is a big issue when the property is occupied by tenants who've been there a long time. That's just the truth. They've been there a long time, and the buyer is an investor. Most cases, they're like, oh, we want them out, but we can't do that. We can't just kick people out because we're selling. So there's multiple ways of dealing with situations. So situation number one is to just say, you know what, we're not going to give vacant possession. If you want the home, you have to buy it while the tenants are there. This worked very well, especially in a hot market, because people are looking to buy a property. Especially this is perfect for investors, you know, people who are looking for an investment property. They can buy this, tenants live there, and after they take possession, they can decide what to do. This is one of the safest ways for a landlord to sell the property, is to not deal with the situation at all and not be involved. Just say, you know what, the property is tenanted. It will be tenanted on the day of closing. So you need to accept that as a buyer. One thing that I want to mention on this point is when you are selling a tenanted property, you want to make sure that you're working with a realtor who understands this. Realtors need to understand that in the residential agreement of purchase and sale, Form 100, that the seller and the buyer will sign, there's already a clause that says the property will be vacant at closing. So if your realtor doesn't read that, or they don't know, they miss it, you end up signing. I've been on the buy side where I'm representing an investor, and I know that the clause is already in there. I know what my client wants. I don't have to write it in Schedule A. I don't have to bring it to their attention. It's up to the listing agent to say, look, you have to assume the tenants. And it's up to them to write it in the Schedule A, or it's up to them to tell me to write it, because I know it's there, my client is protected. However, if they're on the sell side and they don't know to protect their clients, that is on them. So when you're working with a realtor and you want to make sure that the tenants, the new buyers assume the tenants, make sure you write it in the agreement of purchase and sale that the buyer will assume the tenants at closing. Because if you don't write it in there automatically, and when I say this, I'm speaking on the residential side. On the commercial side, it's different. However, on the residential side, if the property is a residential unit, let's say up to 3 units, 1 to 3 units, it has to be written in the agreement of purchase and sale. If it's not, on closing day, as a seller, you'll be surprised, because you'll have agreed to providing vacant possession, and you have to find a way to provide that, or else, you know, it gets into the lawyer's hands, and somebody has to compensate for all that. Now, the only problem with buyers assuming tenants is that it reduces the pool of buyers to investors only. Somebody wants to move into that home, then this is not an option for them. Another thing too, it may result in a reduced sale price, because if there's, let's say, 3 homes on market, especially in the market where we have a lot of inventory, if there's 3 homes on market and one of them is tenanted, the other 2 aren't. Even if they're similar or they're equal, people will buy the vacant ones first, unless this other one is slightly less expensive, then it could be an option. But so in most cases, we've seen that if you choose this option, you end up with a reduced sale price. And at the same time, too, you have much smaller pool of buyers because we're only appealing to investors. Another way to do this is to provide vacant possession to the buyer. Now, there's two ways to provide vacant possession to the buyer. One of them is through a form called an N11, which is a mutual agreement to end the tenancy. And there's multiple ways of doing this. One way is to offer cash for keys or to cooperate with the tenant to see if they'll be willing to move. Another way is through an N12. So you serve notice to end the tenancy to the tenant. And this will depend on multiple factors. One of the factors is, when does the lease end? If the tenant is still within their lease period, so if they have a 1-year lease, or maybe they have 5 months left, you cannot serve notice to move out. They have to wait until the end of the lease. Another point too is you can only use the N12 if the owner or the owner's immediate family intends to move in. In most cases, if I'm on the sell side, if my client is selling, I will get the buyer to sign an affidavit that says, Mr. Seller, I assure you, as soon as you serve notice and we get possession of this property, I or my daughter, my son, my mom, my immediate family member will move in, or a caregiver, right? And guess what? The only thing to the N12 is when you're working with an N12, the tenant doesn't really need to move out if they disagree. I've seen a lot of N12s. Actually, some like this happened to one of the properties. I was on the buy side. My clients were buying the property, and the seller served an N12. And instead of putting, let's say, for example, end of the month, instead of putting May 31st as the move out date, they put June 1st. And that is not correct because you want the tenant to move out at the end of the month. Now, what the tenant did, the tenant knew, like, I don't know how, but they just knew the law. Some tenants, they know the rules and regulations. They know this better than maybe most landlords, I should admit. So what the tenant did, they just waited. They waited until close to closing day, and they said, look, you gave me a wrong notice here. The date's supposed to be May 31st and not June 1st. So for that reason, you have to issue a whole new notice. And now you have to remember the seller has already signed an agreement of purchase and sale with a specific closing date. They had to negotiate with her. In fact, they ended up paying her to move out because of that simple mistake. So the best way to correct for this is to let the proper professionals do it. In most cases, I don't even do it. I have a team of paralegals and lawyers who will step in and do it the right way. Because if we do it wrong, you could end up paying a lot of money just to get the tenant to move out. I must say that out of these two forms, the N11 is my favorite because I feel it releases both parties to the obligation to, because if you save an N12, so much more can happen. First of all, the tenant doesn't have to move out simply because he served it. They can fight it, they can delay the process. You'd have to go to the board and apply and wait for a hearing, all that. However, another thing too that could happen is if indeed you save the N12 and the tenants move out and the buyer decide not to move in or something happens, or maybe there's proof that the N12 was served in bad faith, they can come back and sue the seller. They can come back and sue the new buyer. Now, the reason we like to get the buyer to write and sign an affidavit that says, Mr. Seller, I assure you that I will move in as soon as we take possession, that relieves the seller from, the lawsuits. In fact, in the affidavit that the buyer will sign, it does mention that they take full responsibility and that the seller will not be liable for anything. So now we're protecting the seller, making sure that whatever happens after the sale only applies to the new buyer and what they choose to do with the property. The reason I love the N11 is because literally after you sign the mutual agreement to end the tenancy, the tenant cannot sue you and you cannot sue the tenant either. because you're mutually agreeing to end the tenancy. Now, with cash for keys, it is literally what it is. You're paying the tenant to move out. You may ask, how much money do I pay? You know, I've seen anything from 1,000 to 10,000 to 20,000. It's really a negotiation. And this is where cooperation comes in, because if you've been good, you've been nice to the tenant all along, then this is where you can work with them to see what number. And in most cases, to be honest, when I go to, I've only negotiated my own. I don't negotiate any 11s on behalf of my clients. We have proper professionals who can do it. Why do I do that? Because I know that when I'm working on a transaction, I always treat it like it could end up in court. And if this ends up in court, I want the proper professional, somebody who's qualified to do this work behind you, because I know they're trained for it. They work on this day in, day out, so they have more experience than I do. However, on the N11s that I've negotiated for my own properties, literally it could be any amount. Sometimes we've paid like 2,000, sometimes we paid 3,000, depending on the relationship we have with the tenant, you know, and what their goals are. A lot of the time it's all about finding out what their goals are, right? Like we had one tenant who wanted to move closer to their kids. So they were already thinking it, but you know, so that is an easy situation, you know, be like, you know what, you don't have to worry about paying first and last month rent at the other place. We'll give you the first and last month rent so you can go. And you have to remember with an N12, you have to pay them 1 month rent, right? Whether or not they move or don't move, you still have to pay them 1 month rent. So on average, let's say that's $2,000. So you already have to pay $2,000 simply by saving the N12. So why won't you say pay $3,000, get an N11 signed? Because when you get an N11 signed, both parties are protected. And some of the best things we've done is sign an N11 before we go to market. Because if we have an N11 signed before we go to market, we can open up the property to anybody, really. Vacant possession will be provided as of this date. Then all the buyers know that vacant possession will be provided. And I also find that when you negotiate before you go to market, it's much easier because the tenant is not angry that 30 people just went through the home, because you know, selling a property is hard on anybody who lives in a home. If you ever sold a property, you know. So it's not easy on the tenants that they have 30 people going through their home. So I find that by the end of a week or 2 or 3, however long the property sits on market, the tenant is really like frustrated. And in fact, if they were cooperating at the beginning, by the end of the term, they're not really as cooperative as they were. And I understand that and I expect it, so I know how to manage it. But the truth is, if you're going to negotiate an 11, you're probably better off to do it before you go to market for multiple reasons. One is then you can disclose to all potential buyers that vacant possession will be provided. And 2, you have a better relationship with the tenant. And some tenants will understand it is what it is, but it's much easier to do it at the beginning than at the end, because at the end, they're already upset with the whole process, because it's upsetting. It's not easy, especially with the hard market we just came out of. People would have 8 showings on one day. You know, they can't enjoy their home when they're having 8 showings on one day. So that is why they will not be as happy at the end of the process. However, I expect it. And in most cases too, I'll mention it to them. I'll be like, look, this is not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. So I set expectations and I know it's going to happen because I've seen it happen several times. So this is basically what the bottom line is. If you have to provide vacant possession, you have to make sure that you're doing it properly. Because if you're found to have done something in bad faith, you can be fined up to $50,000. And a lot of people will say, oh, this rarely happens. The tenant never follows up. The truth is, a lot of tenants are very savvy. They know how this works. So they will follow up. And for me, I always err on the side of caution. It's better to be safe than sorry. I would rather negotiate with the tenant, pay them $10,000. In some cases, it's been as much as $10,000. Pay them $10,000 and sell the property at a higher price, because now anybody can buy it. It's open to everybody. We have a bigger pool of buyers. And not only that, avoid paying $50,000 in fines, right? Just make sure that you do things properly. That is my advice. Cooperation and doing things properly. I am thankful we've had properties for maybe 8 years now, and we've never had a bad situation. Why? Because I always approach things from that point of let's work together, and also making sure that I'm doing the right thing. So if we end up in court, I know that I did the right thing. I'd rather do that than pay $50,000 in fines. If you're thinking about selling a tenanted property today, the first thing I would do is I would confirm timelines based on your circumstances. So first of all, I guess what I'm trying to say here is decide that you're actually selling. I'm decided I'm selling, this is the timeline, right? And also look at your situation. Is the tenant on lease? When does their lease end? Are they open to negotiating? Like things like that. So once you confirm the timelines and you know when you want to sell, step number 2 is do not sign new leases. This will apply to also like multiple units. If you have a property that has multiple units, and I'm gonna say this applies only up to 4 units. So if you have up to 4 units, do not, because this is still residential, do not sign new leases. It's much better for the new owner to come in, and most owners will want to tenant that property themselves. So it's easier if you give them a vacant property. The reason I say this only applies after 4 units is because when we go to the commercial side, where we have, up to 30, 40, 200 units, it's better if a property is not vacant for financing purposes. The bank is going to want to see that the property is occupied. So what I'm saying in this case only, especially with signing new leases, that only applies on smaller residential properties. However, when you go to commercial, a lot of banks, a lot of buyers are going to run their numbers. In fact, the valuation of your property will depend on the income. So if you have a bigger apartment building, you definitely want to have those properties tenanted at market rents, just because that will help the valuation of your property. Another thing we want to do, in fact, I usually help with this for my clients, is I go in and inspect the property and assess the condition. You'll be surprised how many landlords don't know the condition of their home. Maybe the tenant has been there for 3 years, 4 years. And sometimes, the tenants, maybe they're good, maybe they keep it clean but the landlord has never been there in 3 to 4 years. I've seen it. So in this case, I say, you know what, Mr. Seller, I will go to your property. You can come with me if you'd like to see it because you haven't been there in a long time. But let's assess the property and let's see if, let's say, it needs any upgrades. If you haven't painted in 4 years, and if they have kids, the property will probably have marks here and there. And we also want to make sure that there's no things that could deter potential buyers, like water. There's been a leak and people can see signs of water. If there's any, water in the basement, we want to make sure that the property looks good. And if the property doesn't look good, we have to basically bring in proper professionals who can help you with renovations and making sure that the property is presentable, especially in this market where there's more properties on the market to compete with. So instead of now competing with, one property, having to compete with 10 because inventory levels have gone up. So now we have to make sure that your property is the one. If there are seeing 10 properties on that street, or maybe let's say five properties in that neighborhood, we want your home to stand out. So that's why we'll go there for an inspection and make sure that the home looks good. Another step in the process will be to inform the tenants about the sale. So once you decided, for sure, this is it, I'm selling, we want to have a conversation with the tenants and let them know that you're thinking about selling. I've had landlords who will send me to their property without telling the tenants that they're selling. And sometimes they don't even warn me. So I go there, I'm like, I'm a realtor, I'm here to see the house. And it's just awkward, First of all, I feel like when that happens, trust is lost. They think that, are they trying to go behind our back, blah, blah, blah. So the best thing is to just be upfront and be honest, because you've already decided that this is happening. So tell them the truth. I've seen the situation where the tenant will literally try to buy it if they can, because that has been their home for a long time. And I feel like as a landlord, when you give them the opportunity to do that, because for me, if when people reach out to me to go to market, it probably takes a good, week or 2, depending on what we need to do on the home. So if you say, okay, Mr. Tenant, I will give you a week, go to your bank, speak to your family members and see if you can buy it if you'd like. I feel like that already sweetens the relationship. And even when we go to market after a week, the tenant is not they're not angry. They're just, they they appreciate that opportunity that you've given to them. You consider them as a human being. And I think in that conversation where they say, okay, I can't afford to buy it, that is when you can start talking to them about an N11, depending on their situation, right? And we've had tenants who've left homes to buy their own. Maybe they'll go to their bank and realize that, you know what, maybe you can't afford $1 million home, but you can buy something for 800. So we'll come in and say, look, you're already going to buy something. Maybe instead of you, staying here, the new owner might want to move in anyway. Let's negotiate and see what it would take for you to start looking for something else. You might have to give them, a little bit of money here and there, but hey, that is expected, right? So having these conversations before we go to market is a much easier situation than the tenant finding out that the property is going to market tomorrow. That usually doesn't turn out well. So having a conversation with the tenants is definitely a good thing. And then after you have those conversations, then we have to look at the kind of renovations that will bring a higher return on your investment. We want to make sure that whatever work you're doing will actually matter. We've seen people sometimes, my clients even have over improved the property because they didn't consult with me before they started the renovations. So in most cases, I'll say, look, let's sit down. Let's see what's worth doing. There are things that are worth doing, and there are things that are just, not as worth it, so we will sit down. We do have a list of renovations and their return on investment. For my clients, especially if this is a rental property, I'm assuming you're an investor, I want you to maximize your return on your money. So I would never recommend you to do work that will not bring anything. There are some things, for example, depending on your budget, if you want to spend $10,000, I will take your $10,000 and allocate it in spaces. I know if you spend on paint, depending also on the condition of the home, if you spend your money on painting, I know that money is coming back. If you spend your money on upgrading the bathroom, I know that money comes back. And how do I know? Because if a property is not painted or the bathroom looks terrible, first of all, it's going to get rid of buyers who don't want to do any renovations. And second of all, those who buy it will already make calculations and account for the renovations that they have to do. And I say that is more true today in this market because buyers have options. In a market like January or December, when buyers didn't have options, my advice to my clients was like, no, let's just put the property on market. We've put properties that I thought would really not sell, and they've sold right away because that was the market. That was the market of the moment. Today, we're in a slightly different market where we have more competition and we have to stand out. So those are things that we have to talk about before we go to market. So this is my contact information for those who would like to know. We are on social media. So we have Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. My handle will be Joseline Nicholas. My email is joseline@joselinenicholas.com. And you can connect with me if you have any questions. So I see here that somebody has a question. Yes, go ahead. Sankov, go ahead.
Okay. I have a quick question. So you know how COVID happened, and yeah. I just recognized that the board, the rental tribunal and the board, like they're not getting back to people, and people have been abusing it, like people, and it's skewed the other way.
It's true.
So what is to be done? Because I have people who did everything the right way, and people refuse to move, and the backlog is so deep.
Yeah. Are they doing it themselves or they're working with a paralegal?
I think people start with themselves, then they go with paralegal, but yeah.
I think maybe we could, because this is a specific situation, I would love to chat with you one-on-one just to see what's happening. I would probably say if it's taking too long, I would, because that's exactly what's happening right now. And to be honest, there are tenants who are taking advantage of that. I've seen it, where tenants literally take advantage of that situation. So that is something that we can chat about. For me, if I was in that place, I'll be looking to see for two things. One, I want to consult with a professional who can say, look, this is what you should be doing, or this is the situation, or maybe this is the quickest way to do it. However, I would also be thinking about a mutual way of getting them out. What can I offer them that'll get them out? Because in most cases, difficult tenants who are really causing a difficult situation, in most cases, they don't have a lot of money. So even if you offer them, and this is not 100% thing, but most of the times, those are not the worthiest of the people. So maybe it doesn't even take too much to impress them, you know? If they've been there, if they stay in that property for another, the way I do, I'm a numbers person, so I'm always looking at numbers. If I wait another 4 months without rent, let's say on average they pay $1,500, that's $6,000. What if I could give them $5,000 and get them out now, right? So those are things that, depending on the situation, obviously, like I don't know enough about it, but if you wanted to chat with me, we can do that. But yeah, I would be looking at possible solutions too, because that's the only way. Unless you wait to go to the board, you have to mutually come to a resolution. So I'd be looking for ways to get to a mutual agreement. Any other questions? I have some questions that I'll get to. Let me get on my, okay, so we have some questions here and I will get started on those. Okay, so a question here is, am I or my realtor responsible to find my tenant a new place to rent if I'm selling my property? This is interesting. Legally, no, you're not responsible to finding them a new place. However, I guess this comes back to that negotiation strategy that we talked about. I've had tenants who tell me, I can't find another place to live. And I'll be like, well, what neighborhood would you like to be in? So I can negotiate to find them another place. If first of all, like I have to find out what their needs are and make sure that the price or the rent they have in mind is realistic. If they say, I want to be in downtown Toronto for $1,000 in a 3-bedroom apartment, I know it's not going to happen. So I'm not going to agree to doing that. However, I can agree to help. And part of that negotiation process where, they agree to terms and conditions, I would say, you know what? Not that I want to put this in writing because I can't guarantee that I'll find you something. However, if you speak to the sellers and come to an agreement that you're moving out, I'll help you find a place. And in most cases, before I agree to that, I will find out what their budget is. But, so basically to answer this question, you're not legally obligated to help them find a place. What you're legally obligated to do is to make sure that you're doing it right. If they are agreeing to moving out, then you're not responsible for anything. You can just, sign an N11 and that's it. However, if you're giving an N12, just make sure that it's being served properly and that proper procedures are followed. Like you have to make sure that you pay them for that 1 month rent. You have to make sure you give them enough time. You have to make sure that it was done by a professional and there are no mistakes, because mistakes will cost you either money or time. Okay, another question we have here is, what if my tenant is unwilling to leave even after 3 months notice? What options do I have? That is a good question. If I was in this place, probably the first thing I would do is connect with the paralegal, make sure you've done everything right. Because it looks like you've given them 3 months notice, but you want to make sure that that notice was done properly. Not only that, you want to make sure you've given them proper notice. Are you using an N11 or N12? An N11, they have to mutually agree. They have to sign it. If they haven't signed, then you don't have anything. However, if you're giving an N12, who is moving in, right? Are you moving in or is the buyer moving in? And another reason why I keep saying work with a professional is because when you serve a notice, professionals can save time because they know to register it with the board right away. Even in the situation of an N11, once it's signed, you have to register it. Because when you register it, then the board recognizes it immediately. And if the tenant doesn't move out, you don't have to wait another 60 days for a hearing, So basically the simplest way I would say is, if you need a professional, and to be honest, not every paralegal is good. So you need somebody who's good. So if you need to connect with a paralegal, let me know. I have a few names in a few cities that I can connect you with. But to answer that question, somebody's not leaving, you have to go through the board. And in most cases, you have to be doing things right. Because if you're not doing it right, they will only challenge you. I'd say connect with a good paralegal and see what they recommend. Another question is, can you repeat where in the agreement of sale said vacant possession? Okay, that's a good point. So I did mention that in the agreement of purchase and sale on page 1, I believe it's clause number 2, it states the closing date. In addition to that, like the very last line, it says the seller will provide vacant possession on closing. So if you are working with a realtor who doesn't know that that clause is there, because I'm a realtor, and I know as realtors, sometimes we don't read things, and it's not a good thing, right? The professional ones will read things. I've learned to read all the forms because there's just a lot of things that come up like you don't think about, but they're there, right? For example, if you're doing work on a property and you have an open permit, there's a clause in the agreement of purchase and sale that says you can't have an open permit, but these are all things that, and I've spoken to, listing agents who say, oh, you didn't write it in the agreement schedule A. And I'll be like, yes, I didn't, because it's already there, right? So you want to make sure that you're working with a realtor who understands these terms. And what I say there about vacant possession is there's usually the agreement of purchase and sale, and it comes with a schedule A. A lot of people pay attention to schedule A because that's what we add in as realtors. If we have any conditions, if we have any clauses, if we have any terms that we have to set about the transaction, most of what we will write is in schedule A. The rest of the agreement of purchase and sale is already standardized, right? So it comes as is. Now we have to know what clauses are standardized. One of those standard clauses is a clause about vacant possession. So if I'm selling a duplex, or I'm selling a single family home, or maybe a triplex, if I do not write in the schedule A that the buyer is to assume tenants, it automatically goes out as though we will provide vacant possession. So you need a listing agent who understands that, because if they don't pay attention to that small thing, it means you've sold your house that is tenanted and you've agreed to provide vacant possession, which means you have to find a solution, on closing. The worst case scenario, the worst thing that happens is people don't find out in good time. If you find out early enough, you can do something about it. But usually people find out a few days before closing, or even on the closing day. And, a lot of transactions will die. And in a market that is declining, a dead transaction is not good for the seller, because that means now you have to sell at a much lower price than what you would have gotten when you sold, So you have to make sure that things are done properly. Any other questions? I'm just looking to see if we're getting any questions from, we also have this live stream on social media. So that's something that I'm watching out for. But yeah, no, this, the landlord tenancy board, it's just a lot of the time I find as a landlord, you want to do things right, because even a small mistake, they will lean towards the tenant side. And I've seen it where small mistakes will cost lots and lots of money. I gave you the example of when the tenant discovered that the date was incorrect, but simply one day. Instead of saying May 31st, they said June 1st. And the tenant waited just because they knew. And the tenant made a lot of money from that, because they had to negotiate with her and pay her out to move out and sign an N11 instead of using the N12. So things like that will definitely cost money. Anyways, if there's any other questions, please let me know. You have my contact information here. Right now it's, let's see what time. Oh, it's 6:56, which is perfect timing for ending this webinar. If anybody has any, we still have 2 to 3 minutes. So if there's any questions, please keep them coming. But at this point, oh, I have one question here. Someone is asking if I can share the slides. We do have a recording of the webinar, so we can share that with you. As for the slides, yeah, I guess I'll consider sharing them too. If you need them, please message me, but the recording is available and we will be happy to share that. Where can I go through the old webinars? That's a good question. So I do have a YouTube channel, and on YouTube, it's Joseline Nicholas. And that's where I have all the previous webinars that I've done. We've been doing webinars for about 2 years now, and most of the recordings will be there. And I do webinars on a regular basis, and most of my webinars have something to do with investing in real estate, because I actually have been an investor longer than I have been a realtor. So I do come with different perspective. I came into real estate because I love it. So I like to educate people on how to make money and build wealth through real estate. That is something that I'm very passionate about. The reason I'm passionate about it is because I feel like real estate can change lives, you know? And I've seen it in my own life too, where like, you know, I can save up for my kids' tuition through real estate. I can save up for my retirement through real estate. So I like to give webinars that educate people on how to build wealth in real estate. And most of that, the previous ones will be on YouTube, and that's Joseline Nicholas on YouTube. Alrighty, so I don't have any more questions. Oh, maybe something came in. Okay, so we don't have any more questions. However, I do appreciate your time. Thank you for taking the time to be here. You are the reason why I keep doing webinars, because, you know, if there was nobody attending, then I wouldn't be doing it anymore. So I'm so glad that I get to share what I know in real estate. And I hope that what I shared today will help you become a better investor, will help you become a better seller, and potentially, you know, build wealth and be successful in real estate. If you have any questions, you can still reach out to me. You have my contact information. So thank you very much and have a great evening.